Stats, glorious stats. There's lots of questions one can ask when looking at all the numbers on a unit card. Some questions I get asked a lot relate to the stat ranges. What number do you call low leadership? How much is high armor? Where does bad melee defense end and good melee defense begin? Well, these are some of the questions that this video will hopefully answer. If you have no idea about the stats, you can either tooltip over them in the game yourself and read them to try and get your head around them, or I'll link a couple of videos at the top of the description where I've talked about them in the past. Maybe watch those first if you want to get your head around this, but I'll also link them at the end. It doesn't really matter too much what order you learn it all in. And also realize these are just my rough estimations of what I call low, medium or high stats. Others may have slightly different ranges. So, a couple of things to understand before we get into the stats themselves, starting with unit size. For infantry, it ranges from about 60 to 120 on large unit sizes. For example, a unit of Chosen only has 60 models in it, so that could be considered a small unit, and this is usually because they're so powerful. More powerful units have smaller unit sizes, with weaker units having bigger unit sizes, like the Skaven Slaves have 135, but about 90 to 120 is your average unit size. But of course this number varies over cavalry and monsters and everything else. And it's all closely linked to your hit points, your health, your HP, your freaking life. Honestly, you don't really need to worry too much about HP, but it is going to be directly affected by how many models are in the unit. Honestly, there's too wide of a range over all the different units to put any numbers on it, but as a rough estimation you could put 6,000 or 7,000 on an infantry, up to maybe 14,000, 15,000 on something like a Dread Saurian. But anyway, those two things are a little bit less relevant, so let's get into the good stuff. Beginning with armor, the stat that protects you from base damage of an enemy's weapon. I'd call low armor about 30 or below. So that's your Empire Swordsman, your Bleak Swords. You'll often find these kind of numbers on Wizards as well, casters. But some units may even have 0 armor, but they usually make up for this in some other way, either being unbreakable or having some kind of physical resistance. As you move up the armor numbers and get to about 70, well, now we're starting to get into some okay to good territory for an amount of armor. You can go all the way up to 120 being the maximum amount of armor for most types of units. There are some that have more, like an Arachnarok Spider has 150, but anything over about 100 armor is considered pretty damn great. So if you look at the Marauder Berserkers on the left there, they've only got 15 armor, which is pretty poor. They're not very well protected from base damage. On to good old leadership, one of the most important stats in the freaking game. About 50 could be considered low leadership, a few units do come down to 40, 60 is also quite a common number, which isn't great but not completely terrible. When you get to around 70, well, now we're looking at some good leadership. Your unit will fight a fair time before they run away. And anything at about 80 or above, up to 100, which means they're unbreakable, well, these are all really good leadership numbers, and you know your unit is there for the long haul. So if we refer back to these Marauder Berserkers, you can see they've got 80 leadership. So that is a really nice amount of leadership to have. They're going to be really difficult to rout off the battlefield. You're going to have to try to kill them if you want to get rid of them, because they will stick around for a while with lots of leadership and good old fighting spirit. Now, how fast can your boys' feet carry them? Well, that's all about speed, obviously. If we're talking infantry, then 28 is a pretty slow foot speed as infantry goes. This is things like Dwarfs and Chosen, big heavy things that have a lot of armor on generally. As you move up, you may get to 31, 32 speed, which isn't too bad. Get to about 35 and you're looking at some good speed on an infantry. And when you enter the 40s, you're getting pretty damn quick for something on foot. You can get up to 48 speed with mostly naked ladies like Witch Elves and War Dancers. And then when we move into large kind of units, monsters have about 50 to 60 speed, whether that's monstrous infantry or a single large monster. Cavalry can be somewhere between 60 to 90, perhaps 66 for big heavy cavalries, and then about 90 odd for light cav, things like skirmish cavalry. And then once we get into the air with some of the fastest units in the game, generally smaller, lighter flying units like Eagles, they can reach up to 110 speed, some 100, some 105. But bigger, slower flying units like Dragons are generally about 70 to 80, so a bit slower, but still pretty freaking quick. So the 37 speed that these Berserkers have is a damn nice speed for closing distances with some haste. A pretty common one for these damage dealer type units. Now on to good old melee attack, the stat that decides whether your unit hits or misses with their weapon. Somewhere in the low 20s could be considered low melee attack, which means the unit may not be fantastic at actually putting out their damage. When you get to about 30, well, now we're talking some pretty good melee attack, not too bad, we can do some work with that. When we get 40, that's pretty nice, that's a good amount to have for an infantry. As we get into different types of units like lords and heroes, they can have way more, 50, 60, Archaon has 70, but most infantry, cavalry and monstrous infantry will have somewhere around these numbers. And with the berserkers, they've got 40 melee attack, so that's a damn good melee attack number for them to be able to put out a lot of damage, as they are a damage dealer unit. They've got frenzy, they've got a lot of weapon strength, they can do some good work with that 40 melee attack. And onto the melee attack counterpart, melee defense, the stat that determines if a unit is any good at dodging attacks. These are kind of similar amounts to the melee attack. 20 could be considered low, 25 still pretty low. As you get up to around 35, that's a nice bit of melee defense. That means your unit can stay in prolonged combat and survive pretty well. They're not going to take damage too quickly, and they'll be able to keep fighting for longer. As you get into the high 40s and 50s, that's some really nice melee defense, which is really going to help your unit survive for a long time and avoid damaging attacks. Some units can have much higher than this, like the Iron Breakers have 68 melee defense, so they're obviously tough as scheisse. And again, lords and heroes could have a fair bit more, so definitely an important stat to keep an eye on. As we can see with the berserkers, they've only got 24 melee defense. They're not great at avoiding damage, but that's part of their thing. They're a damage dealer unit, so they have low armor, low melee defense, but they have really high attack and weapon strength instead. Now, speaking of weapon strength, next is weapon strength. How much damage does the weapon that you're smashing your enemy in the face with actually do? Well, starting with the infantry, around 25 is fairly low, not a ton of damage from that kind of weapon strength. As we move up into 30, 35, well, now we're talking. Now we're starting to put out a little bit more damage from whatever unit it is. And moving up into the 40s, especially the 50s, well, now we've got some freaking weapon strength and we've got some goddamn clout behind our weapon. 50 plus is especially high for melee infantry. As you can see, the berserkers have 52, so they're able to hit really damn hard with those axes, which coupled with the melee attack means we've got a lot of damage to output. And these numbers are kind of similar for cavalry as well. As we move into monsters, about 70 to 100 is the rough range. Of course, 100 being better. A lot of that is often armor piercing as well, so they can put out plenty of damage. Moving into lords, they obviously get a hell of a lot of damage, usually about 350 to 500. 350 for lesser melee characters, maybe some heroes. Wizards a bit lower, about 300. And then when you get into the big boys like Grombrindle, Grimgor, Nakai, they're smashing out 500 plus, and of course, killing everybody. And last but not least, charge bonus, the multiplier that adds on to your melee attack and weapon strength if you charge your unit in. On melee infantry, 8 is pretty damn low, and you won't get too much lower than this. This can be on crappy units like goblins, but as we get up to 20 into the mid 20s, now we've got a fairly decent charge bonus. We can do a bit of extra damage with that, not too shabby. But as we move up into the 30s, mid 30s, that's a fairly decent charge bonus that'll give you a little bit of extra kick on your charge. If you want to get into the big boy charge bonuses though, you start messing around with cavalry and chariots. You'll start to get around 50 to 70 for shock cavalry, which is a big part of their plan as they like to cycle charge and get that charge bonus over and over again. It's good for them to have high charge bonuses. Lords and heroes, some single monsters also can have these higher charge bonuses, but some are on the lower end, like infantry. And if you once again cast your eyes to the Marauder Berserkers, a 33 charge bonus they do have, a very nice amount that will aid them in being a very nice damage dealer unit. So there you go, there's some stat ranges which will hopefully help you read the unit cards a little better. So when you look at these and you see Minotaurs with only 35 armor and 65 leadership and 32 melee defense, you know their survival isn't gonna be top notch. When you get to Malice and you see his weapon strength 400, which is armor piercing, so that's a pretty good amount. Nice big charge bonus, nice bit of melee attack, he can dish out some damage. When you get to Chaos Knights, you can see they've got a ton of armor at 120, massive charge bonus, so they're going to be pretty tough and they can dish out some good damage with that mighty charge bonus. So there we have it, stat ranges, some rough guidelines on what sort of numbers mean what, low, medium, high, extra high. You should hopefully now be able to figure them out mostly for yourself. If you'd like to learn more about stats though, you can check out any of these here videos, which will hopefully have a little bit more information for you. I thank you for watching, I hope you've enjoyed this, I will see you in the future.